Hello. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight on behalf of Blair Gowdy and Archery Yes Group. For those of you who don't know, we're a non-political party group of like-minded people, all with a common goal of looking for Scotland to become an independent country. Everybody's welcome to join the group, and I hope that over the course of the next few months, as we drive on towards independence, that we'll have a few speakers who can come and give us the benefit of their expertise and their understanding of the different political situations that Scotland will face. I've got to admit tonight, before I introduce Lesley, that I almost got everything off to a bad start. I was doing a bit of research on the internet about background, and I picked up on a comment which had suggested that Lesley had said that she thought Theresa May was out of this world. I was kind of taken aback by that, and I was almost going to phone Kevin and cancel the gig. But when I did more research, I found out what she really did say. And she said she didn't know what planet Theresa May was on. And I think that was probably more in line with where Lesley's coming from. Born in Wolverhampton, Lesley spent 10 years, her first 10 years growing up in Belfast. And at the age of 13, her parents moved to Bearsden. Lesley then went on to Oxford University and became, at 21, the youngest female to become president of the Students' Union. So I think it's an incredible achievement at the time that happened. Not that it was so long ago, but after Oxford, Lesley went on to Cardiff University and took a diploma in journalism. From there followed a series of life-developing events through journalism, broadcasting, setting up a newspaper with ladies in Africa, and all sorts of other ventures, good and bad, along the way, until eventually Lesley's ended up being a person that I think the whole of Scotland can look up to with great respect about the way that she looks at things, researches things, deals in facts, and can relate these in a very clear way that people can understand. So I think we're very, very blessed to have her here tonight, and I hope you can give her a warm welcome from Blair Gowdy.
Thanks very much. No pressure. Yes, that was a bit of a shocker, actually. My brother and I family grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and when we were 11, we knew that my parents were Highlanders. My mother was from Wick, my dad was from a road junction in Banffshire, which we visited each of them for 2 weeks every summer for 16 years. So we knew that there was Scots in the family. But the shock when we were told at the age of 11 that we were actually born in Wolverhampton. I mean, but anyway, you know, the Mongol nation was never truer for our family anyway. And perhaps that's kind of really quite relevant now, because what I really want to talk about is to look over the weather that we're experiencing at the moment. And what we're in is weather. I mean, it's important weather. Weather can be extremely destructive. But actually, what we're looking for is climate change. We're looking to get right out of a situation where we are tethered to a backward-looking, archaic, elitist, unequal government, and a society populated in the main part by a population that just doesn't seem to care about these things. Or if it does, never translates that into anything approaching what would be needed to modernise Britain. to make it anywhere you'd want to stay. So in all of that, if you look forwards, I think one of the things that can sometimes be difficult for people is the feeling that we are doing this alone. That we alone in Europe, I mean, everybody feels like this when they do anything in life for the first time, actually. You know, you feel like there's nobody like yourselves, you're having all the problems yourself, nobody's ever seen this kind of thing. We're the last. In the North Atlantic, we're the last nation to look for independence. I hear there's like a wee drum roll happening behind everything here, so are you alright with that? There's something rattling in the microphone or somewhere. Is it yourself? Is it my imagination? Okay. So I mean, this is what I really want to look at, because the kind of, if you had the same education I had, I mean, here I grew up in Northern Ireland, and we knew nothing about the history of Northern Ireland because obviously it was too hot to trot. You know, we learned a lot about Brian Boru because I think he existed and died before it all got a little bit sectarian, and then it stopped, and we learned English history. When I came to Scotland, hey, I knew how to do this. We learned English history. So everybody of an age, and there's a few of us around here, will not really have been steeped in what is relevant at our latitude. But what's relevant to Scotland is not just the great imperial histories of England vis Britain, or France or Germany, although these have been powerful and influential. It's not even the United States. It's a lot to do with the small countries beside us that have been airbrushed, actually, out of our ken. That is the Nordic countries that have actually been doing extraordinarily well and sort of negating every argument that's been punted Scotland's way. They're small, that's problematic, strange. They actually happen, the lot of them, apart from Iceland that's getting back, and they happen to have AAA credit rating. We don't. They happen to be at the top of every well-being table that you can get. Table. It's tedious. It's tedious how well they do. Iceland is practically at 100% literacy. And this is Iceland, a country that was so inhospitable that it was actually discovered 3 times before anyone stayed. You know, we need to know more about our own extended folk. We know about our own folk, we've got an idea about the Celts, but actually we're part of a bigger thing. If Alex Salmond, with his ineffable timing, hadn't kiboshed slightly the arc of prosperity by lining us up with Ireland, Norway and Iceland at a time when Iceland was about to go off the register and Ireland was about to follow it, we would probably have a little bit of a more idea now, or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps the only reason that people know much about the Nordics is that we reference. But this could be extremely important for Scotland for 2 reasons. One is, we should get our peckers up. We are a sleeping giant. We're not a small country. From the perspective of where we are, in the North Atlantic, we are enormous. You know, has anyone been to the Faroe Islands? Right, well done, Jason. It is a bit like your last Monroe, actually. I've been to all the Nordic countries before I got to the Faroes, although they're the closest. But there are 18 little barren lumps of rock between Shetland and Iceland. And actually, although they haven't got a lot going for them apart from their fishing, they do have the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. And any time you hear this from a unionist, just say the words, the Faroes. And the reason is that in 1946, they took a vote, all 30,000 of them. What's the population of Blair, Gowrie and Rattray? Let's sling an airlift. About there?
9.
9. What we're going to have to sling in as well, then Cooperangus. Well, okay, we're not going to sling in Cooperangus. Anyway, you see what I'm saying? It's not a big population. But these guys decided in 1946 that they wanted to become independent from Denmark. So they had a referendum, and the result was 50.7% yes, which sort of scared the bejesus out of everybody, themselves included. But the Danes did something that the British would never do. They realised they needed to persuade them to stay with a good offer. So what they gave the Faroese was this extraordinary parliament. It's got the usual stuff, it's got all the tax-raising powers that we have not got. It's got a university for 40,000 people that teaches in Faroese, which is a language different from Danish and more like Icelandic. They have control of energy, which is pretty important. If we had that in Scotland, we would have won the independence referendum. And they have control of telecoms and broadcasting. Ditto. Now, not just because of the obvious about broadcasting, but telecoms. I'm glad you're all sitting down, because if you were standing, there could be a few casualties at this. They have the fastest mobile broadband coverage in the world. And the reason is, steady now, the reason is that the Faroese government told Faroese Telecom to do it. I mean, it's that simple. Everybody, you know, Britain is complicated, isn't it? We've got this ludicrous privatised system for telecommunications, for electricity, for everything. So nobody seems to be able to do anything straightforward, but the Faroese just told them to fibre optic the entire set of islands. So they have the fastest 4G coverage in the world, those little remote islands. And it doesn't just go to the 18 islands, remote as they are. It goes right to the edge of the 200-mile limit they unilaterally declared, and up to the height of the helicopter fleet that services it. Because as they put it, this is our community. Why would we leave anyone out? James. You know, that kind of level of ambition, that's what comes from having had the world's most powerfully devolved parliament since 1946. But the icing on the cake for them was that even way back then, they were given the power to sign international treaties. Now that maybe didn't seem like such an important thing until 1973, when Denmark decided to join the EU at the same time as Britain. And the Faroese took one look at the common fisheries policy and went, nah, we're not having that. Because it's not usable for anybody that's got a large, 90% of the income in the Faroes is fish. So some of you, I see, sitting around the room, were alive in 1973. You may not have heard of many people dying in the conflicts between Faroes and Denmark over this, because there wasn't any. The Faroese just decided not to join the EU at the same time as the Danes decided to join, and nobody was dead. You know, that is normal. That is the way a normal modern state is able to accommodate difference. And it arose from the fact that the first time that there was a challenge, the Danish state were kind of mature enough to give the Faroese a lot of power. It hasn't stopped them, they still want independence, but they haven't actually achieved it yet. So there's one example of what you might think. I mean, it'll never happen in Britain, and this is important to know, because if we don't know what everybody else has expected and has achieved in the same situations as us, we will think that somehow we're maybe, you know, this is inevitable, or who would expect anything better. We should be expecting better, because it's been happening better than this all around us for half a century. So there's the Faroese. Greenland also belongs to Denmark. Greenland hadn't rocked the boat by having an independence referendum, so it didn't get such a powerful parliament. But in the 1980s it did. First thing they did, they came out of the EU because the same thing, because of the common fisheries policy. So there's one little kind of example of what the Nordics could tell us about how we might relate to Europe as an independent country. But there's others there. I mean, coming back to Iceland, Iceland and Norway are not in the EU, as you may know. They're in what you would call the halfway house. Now this is the science bit, so this is 30 seconds and then it's over, right? Stay awake. There was 2 kids on the block, trade-wise, in the 1960s in Europe. One of them was the kid that would become the EU, but the other one was the kid that has remained EFTA. That's the European Free Trade Association. And EFTA folk were less keen. EFTA was never into integration. It never wanted institutions. It didn't want a shared currency. It just wanted to trade. And over the peace, the UK was in EFTA. Over the peace, it was mostly the Alps and the Nordics were in EFTA, and the UK. And over the peace, almost everybody shifted over to the EU. It shows you actually, at the time, everybody found the prospects of what the EU were up to quite exciting. So in the end, there's only 4 left in EFTA. There's Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. They're tiddlers. And out of them, 3 of them want to have access to the single market. Unaccountably, the Swiss, despite the fact that they're living in the middle of Europe, don't seem to want to have access. You wonder if they've just got a lot of Bakshi arrangements that they don't want to kind of declare. But actually, they spent 9 years negotiating their own bilateral agreements. So you want to do it your own way? It takes time, which someone south of the border might have picked up a while ago. So anyway, the 3 then, these guys, they all don't want to be affected by the Common Agricultural or Fishery Policy. So the 3 of them have created a third organisation called the EEA. That's the European Economic Area. And that is the combination of the 28, soon to become 27, EU members, and these 3. Together, they are the EEA. And it doesn't have much of a secretariat, but it lets you into the single market. So, Iceland and Norway, they can trade into the single market without tariffs. They have to abide by the 4 acquis. They have to have freedom of movement. So that's why Britain's never going to get in. You should say as well, none of EFTA want Britain in because it's massively too big. But the other bonus potentially for independent Scotland in this is that they aren't members of the European Customs Union. And that means that if Britain goes ahead and disastrously decides to complete Brexit what must be the absolute kind of climax of the ludicrousness of the isolationism of Britain and its pomposity, so it jumps right off the top of the cliff despite itself, and we are clever enough to have detached ourselves before they go. If this all happens, our joining EFTA rather than the EU would allow us to make third-party arrangements, that is with Britain, as well as having access to the single market, because we wouldn't be in the customs union. And that could be kind of quite useful for us, because otherwise we're going to be in the same position as Ireland. And, there's something to be said for that. The EEA has got its downsides. Nothing could be all that great. You don't get something for nothing. You end up paying, each nation pays about 98% of what they would pay as full members. You didn't get much of a discount. And you didn't get much of a say in the rules. Norway, for example, they call the EEA the Nike agreement in Norway because you just do it. You get all these regulations and you just have to abide by them. You didn't get a say in them. And Norway implements about 96% of EU regulations, more than Sweden, which is a member. So that's, if you like, there's a downside of that. But, I can't remember where I was at recently, when somebody pointed out, it could have been Angus Brenton McNeill, who was pointing out that across the world, oh dear, across the world there are only 5 countries that are not in regional trade agreements, and one of them is South Sudan. This is the kind of almost failed state we're talking about that isn't in a regional agreement with the rest of its neighbours in trade. We will. I wish I could actually rhyme off the 5 because I'm sure they're a pretty unprepossessing group. But there's where Britain's headed: South Sudan, Britain. It's that unusual to not have got something sorted out with your neighbours. So that's kind of like one possibility. And I know a lot of people in Scotland were worried about the fishing, because the Common Fisheries Policy has got challenges. 60% of fish is caught by boats from countries that are not Scotland. We've opened our waters and seen most of the fish disappear. There are big problems about conservation, partly because of that way of running it. So it's very likely if we were in EFTA, we would get control of fishing, we might do a better job. And that's the kind of company we'd be in. Iceland and Norway, no slouches, these folk. These are the kind of people we should be rubbing shoulders with. If we're kind of looking at problems for Scotland, like, should we be drilling out every last bit of oil in the North Sea, every last bit of now making the change across to a green future? I mean, Nicola talks very well about the fact that Scotland could be leading in the move from the oil era to the green one, but actually we're still drilling. Now, the folk that you want to talk to, who you want to discuss that with. You can try and discuss it with England. They're not interested. They're building nuclear power stations as long as they can get the French and the Chinese to cough up the money, because the City of London recognises it's a really bad deal. Despite having the longest lease periods, despite the biggest subsidies, no one wants to touch nuclear. But that's the kind of, effectively, almost puerile debate that we're in energy terms in Britain. Take it wider, and you get a completely different look at that same situation. The Lofoten Islands in Norway, exactly the same problem. They are the spawning ground of 70% of the fish in the northern seas. Should they be drilling for oil there? They're pretty confident there's huge reserves. Well, we might all get up on our high horses and say, no, 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 they shouldn't be doing that. What about us? The Icelanders, a bit the same. They have geothermal energy. They use that to power everything. They get such cheap energy from it that they take all the dirty industries in, like aluminium. Will they stop doing that? Probably not. They have the same dilemma as us because they are energy-based economies. We are. We would be if we had control of energy, because we could decide what we were connecting up. As it is, the islands that have got the best wind capacity and the emerging marine capacity still don't have cables to the mainland. And this is 20 years we've been talking about this. Meanwhile, little islands that have much, much less take from the wind in Denmark have got 2 1 gigawatt cables in that period. We are so chronically underinvested in here. So that's maybe one future for us, is fitting in with the halfway house kids, and it's not a bad one. I mean, just coming back to Iceland, last year I ran a group called Nordic Horizons. It took a lot of people over from each Nordic country to sort of hear how they had dealt with their relations with Europe. Well, the guy who came from Iceland was a chap called Jon Balvin Hannebalsson. I didn't know much about him before he came. He was a pretty stirring speaker, and afterwards we decided to make this little book, Smorgasbord, about each of the different countries' experiences, and actually it's like a little guide to the Nordics. So I sort of researched each speaker, because I thought, you'll know Ken, these folk, you think needs a little bit of fluffing up. And I discovered something really quite remarkable about Jon Balvin. In 1991, Lithuania declared independence. And within about 5 days, there were 14 people dead at the TV station, trying to protect it from tanks that had rolled in from the Soviet direction. And nobody, this might sound familiar to you, thinking about Catalonia, nobody would recognise Lithuania. Nobody wanted to antagonise the Russians. Quite evidently, the West had decided it was better to be dealing with the devil you know, Yeltsin and co, than the possibility they would go back to communism. So they were prepared to overlook some wee transgressions at Lithuania's occupation. But a wee guy got on a plane in Reykjavik, flew to Vilnius, got out, went into the middle of all this melee, and on behalf of the people of Iceland, Jon Balvin Hannebalsson formally recognised Lithuania as an independent country. And that stopped the rot. That one action stopped the slide. And within a couple of weeks, there was 4 other countries recognised Lithuania, and within a year, it was a member of the United Nations. And when the same thing happened in Estonia and Latvia, on each occasion, the first guy in, same again, Jon Balvin. Iceland was the first country to recognise the independence of each Baltic state. And that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because here's Iceland, population 250,000 at the time. 300,000 now. In history, there have never been more than 1 million Icelanders, ever. But those guys know how to put all their clout on one square when they need to. I couldn't believe I'd been sitting next to this guy. He's a blinking hero, and I hadn't even known him. Nobody had said anything about it. So I asked him, and I said, what was it made you think that you guys could intervene like this? And he said, well, we thought about it, and we realised the West didn't care because it was playing big geopolitics. But actually, they were wrong. They were morally wrong. They were wrong for small countries, because we need other small countries in the world like us. Small countries are buffers against these dangerous big nations. And we decided that somebody would have to act. Why shouldn't it be Iceland? glory be for the Icelanders. And half their DNA is Celtic, the female half. So the thing is, that's the kind of, these are our neighbours. These people we share DNA with. You know, this is the kind of approach that independent-minded nations take, because they know they can act, they know they need to act. So there's Iceland, there's Norway. The Norwegians, again, although they're not in the EU, huge believers in Europe. You may know that Norway was occupied by Germany during the Second World War. When the Germans finally left, all the political parties in Norway stood on the same manifesto in the elections in 1945. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. A lot of people said that Norway became independent in 1905, but it didn't know what that was for until 1945, when there was this incredible sense of national purpose. And after that, as again you may know, they had social democratic governments that transformed Norway from the second poorest country in Europe after Portugal to the world's most wealthy country per head of the population, with its sovereign wealth fund that we can only stand back and wish and imagine. And some of the reasons that Norway embarked on that, well, that's sad for us too, actually. Things tend to follow templates in life, and the reason that the Norwegians effectively kept public ownership of their oil wealth is because they had done that already with the first kind of wealth they got, which was hydroelectric power. When Norway became independent in 1905, it discovered that all its big rivers had actually been bought up mostly by English industrialists. And it just really realised, I mean, the rivers were pivotal for them. It was going to produce all their energy. It was also how they got all their timber out. So they realised they couldn't have that. So they basically nationalised the rivers. They took that back. And the outlook they had was, from that moment on, that hydroelectricity was something that was a community asset. It didn't belong to the guy that had the river. And of course, there really isn't feudal land ownership in Norway, so that was kind of easy. So the profits of hydropower came to the state, but more than that, it came to the local state. The money came right back to the municipalities that the hydro dams were in. And these municipalities are small, unlike Scotland. There are 429 councils in Norway. There are 32 councils in Scotland. We each have 5 million folk. So this is a powerful, powerful municipalism in Norway, which rests on the money they got from hydroelectricity, which rests on the fact that it was not allowed to be the asset of one private individual. And of course, when oil came along, that template was already there in people's heads. Energy doesn't belong to a private individual. And so their oil was seen as a sort of state asset. In Scotland, we had a different history. Coal was our first energy, and coal belonged to the landowner on whose land it was found. So private ownership was very much the template set up in our country with energy. And oil, well, there was then the divvying up of all the different fields, but it was sold and traded, and there wasn't this idea that it was a community asset, because it had never started that way for us. And we need to know these things, because actually what's happened in Scotland is not the way everybody else has experienced life, and that is actually a big contributor to the success of our neighbours, like Norway. But okay, that's one option for Scotland as an independent country. Then we go for the halfway house, we go for EFTA, we don't become fully EU members, and we knock about with the Icelanders and the Norwegians. It's not a bad one. The other option, if you look at full EU membership, actually that's pretty tasty as well. When I was talking about the guys who decided not to become full EU members, you could see one word dominating the entire thing, and it is fish. If you've got fish, you're in the EU. And the other word that really dictates why you would be in the EU as a Nordic country is Russia. I think it was Ludovic Kennedy was quoting Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Premier, when he said that being in Scotland was like being in bed with an elephant. And he wasn't trying to be unpleasant about our southern cousins, he was just talking about a size. 60 million people move in the bed, the wee ones kind of just get squashed. And he was talking about Canada and America have got the same relationship. Well, if we are in bed with an elephant, the folk in Finland are in bed with a stegosaurus. Because Russia is right cheek jowl. You may know that there's been 2 wars fought in the last century to regain land in Karelia, which the Finns lost. There's no love lost still in some respects there, but through the whole experience the Finns have learned to become a truly neutral country. They have to. There's a stegosaurus over there. And what does that mean? It means that the Finns have a constitutional bar on being members of NATO. That is so that they're basically saying to the Russians, you didn't need to invade, there will never ever be an American base on Finnish soil. And the Swedes are the same. They have a constitutional bar. And so the whole of Baltic politics is very influenced by the presence of Russia. So where does their foreign policy and their security come from? It comes from membership of the EU. And that's the largest driver in their wanting to be big fans and members of the EU. They're the only Nordic country that's in the Euro. So they are big believers. The Swedes were pretty sceptical about the EU. They didn't join when everybody else did. And there was one reason why. They have the highest standards of welfare provision in the world. And they thought pretty well that if they joined the EU, all their standards would drop. Now this is quite an extraordinary thing because for us it's exactly the opposite. Most of us, I mean people who are again old enough will remember the days of Thatcher. The only thing that seemed to stand up to Thatcher and her thinking a lot of the time was actually the EU. The Working Time Directive was the first thing that gave overtime to lots of Scots. And every time I've mentioned this to the audience, someone comes up at the end and says, that was me, I got overtime for the first time as soon as that was passed. And that seemed to describe a hugely different approach to the horrible, devil take the hindmost kind of capitalism that Thatcher was pushing through. This was a different social democratic kind of outlook. You shouldn't just thrash people to death in the workplace. There had to be limits. There had to be rules. So I think for a lot of Scots who were alive at the time, I think that's what gave a lot of us our sort of almost knee-jerk fondness for Europe, for the EU, because it seemed decent. It seemed to have standards that chimed with what we would like ourselves. So consider that those standards that we look up to and think, whoa, the gold standards, the standards that, for example, gave maternity and paternity rules here because the EU basically kicked the British arse until they came up with something that complied with their protocols. The same standards that mean that Scotland has the best water and air quality in Britain, and that's not saying much. All of those were considered too low by Sweden. And that tells you something about the kind of incredible power there is in the Swedish state, because they were really doubtful about being dumbed down by standards we regarded as almost utopian. But by the 1980s, their economy was starting to wobble. The Berlin Wall had come down. They began to think that trying to have socialism in one country-ish wasn't really going to solve the world's problems. They realised they were going to have to get engaged again, so they joined the EU through gritted teeth. And some of you may not know that you actually do know the current Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. She's a woman called Isabella Lövin, and she had a picture of herself taken with signing an executive order with all her female ministers behind her. Do you remember? When President Trump had that one with all the guys? That was the riposte. And what was she actually riposting with? What was she signing? Well, she was actually recommitting Sweden to raising their standards in the fight against climate change and global warming. Now again, I can say that as a sentence, that is gobsmacking. The proportion of renewable energy in the whole energy mix in Sweden is 62%. The proportion of renewable energy in the energy mix in Britain is 4%. And that is despite a 100% renewable electricity contribution from Scotland. That's how low it is. If you looked across 28 European countries, the only countries with less renewable energy in their mix are Malta and Luxembourg, maybe South Sudan. So that's what I'm trying to get over here. The Swedes are already practically the most renewably powered society on earth, and they're redoubling their efforts, and there's a reason. What she was saying in that executive order was not just digging Donald Trump up with a footy. She was saying, we basically must accept that the United States is absent in terms of thought leadership for the rest of this decade. And if we are not going to let huge problems like climate change, migration, all these big crises just run out of control, then what forum is placed to tackle it? And she's saying it's the EU, it has to be the EU that tackles this. So Sweden are in there running and jumping, trying to get the EU to buckle up and to redouble its efforts to create a different kind of society. So that's kind of attractive. And then we've got the Danes. The Danes joined in 1973. They've never been hugely pro the EU. They've actually had more referendums on aspects of EU policy than any country but Ireland. By God, the Irish know how to do referendums. But they're still there. And after Brexit, there were so many confident predictions that country after country would follow Britain out. And they didn't. A single one of them did. Even those that had really substantial UKIP horrible kind of parties there, even those that had big right-wing racist parties as members of their parliament, they didn't follow Britain because nobody will follow Britain because it's crazy. So there you are, as another possible future for Scotland as an independent country. There's another possibility within the EU. Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Scotland. That's quite a back four. And again, that's the kind of societies we should be rubbing shoulders with. Societies that have got very high standards. We are getting into the season where we'll congratulate ourselves a lot. When we creep into January, the burns will all be coming flowing out. We'll be talking about a man's a man for all that, and we're all Jock Tanson's bairns. All those ideas about communitarianism will be spouted again. Do you know, I want to create that society outside my head before I die. It's not enough to have it inside you, we need it outside us. Or all the problems we've gone through in our lives just get trailed through for our kids. And these countries have managed it. And the great thing is, they speak English. If you've actually been to any of the Nordic countries, they speak better English than us. I mean, the Norwegians imported every British sitcom, but principally Fawlty Towers and Monty Python, which is a particularly unusual way to learn your English. I was in the very north of Norway and was able to do an entire argument sketch, which is one of the more obscure ones, with a guy in Karasjok, population 2,700. And this is in Samiland, right in the very north of Norway. And so actually, that's also why the Norwegians were unsympathetic to Scottish independence. They couldn't see why anybody wanted to divorce Monty Python. I mean, seriously, as serious as that. The British culture is huge for them. Which was the first country to recognise Norwegian independence in 1905? Britain. So, they get it now. I mean, every country in Europe gets it now. They get the difference. Strange the way that life works out. You know, the straightforward referendum just didn't make sense to many people in Europe. But yeah, they get this thing, the difference, the very visible difference of attitude there is towards Europe, they get that. Some of you may know, I was over in Barcelona 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence. Astonishingly enough, on a BBC World programme, seconding one of the Catalan leaders against the Spanish foreign minister and an EU constitutional expert. Now, it was a very interesting debate. But at the end of it, the constitutional expert chappie came up and said, you must understand that we really is different from Catalonia. Because you were a nation. We get that you have been a state, you've been a separate state. And the other thing is, you guys are civic nationalists. It's interesting to see what scares Europeans. What scares Europeans is religious, ethnic, those kind of differences. And it's funny because in many respects, Scotland has suffered from the fact that we don't have this kind of bonding glue that having a different language from the folk you try and separate from creates. And I've often thought that it's a difficulty for us, that in many respects we're pretty interchangeable. But strangely, from the European point of view, that suits them big Jim dandy. They're not one folk whose reason for wanting to be independent is that they're a different ethnicity from the folk over there, or they're a different religion. At the time I was hearing that, of course, you don't want to be sort of digging the hole any deeper for the Catalans, so you can't really go down the road of saying, yeah, we're totally different, we're brand new, we're different from everybody else. Because, in the end, a lot of the issues will be the same. Spain, so ironic, their Prime Minister Rajoy, this just extraordinarily archaic figure that makes Britain look modern. Let's just deviate there for a second. I found myself, I thought, wow, I hope nobody's watching this back home, having to say that as far as dealing with constitutional conflict properly, Britain was the gold standard. Because the Edinburgh Agreement made the outcome of the referendum legally binding on both sides. It didn't have to. I can remember being in a debate with Jim Wallace, who was babbling on about we might not give you the Section 30 powers. And after about 20 minutes of this, I kind of leant over and put my hand on his shoulder and said, Jim, could you just get over yourself with that? You know you're going to give us these powers. Can we get to the heart of this debate? And actually, although it seemed to take forever, they did. I mean, they didn't try to pretend that what is a political difference, because we had an elected government with a mandate for independence referendum here and a different outlook in Westminster, they didn't try to hide that under a constitutional cloak. They actually took that as a political argument head on and then did Project Fear. I'll grant you. But the basis of it was a square go. The Spanish won't do that. They're still pretending it's a constitutional issue. They're not allowing these guys to have the straightforward political discussion they want to have. They're hiding behind the Constitution. And it was extraordinary. So many people came up and said, wow, the British were really great with you, with your independence referendum. And I was having to actually accept that was probably true. But it's also very significant because, when I was talking about Norway and the question of energy, what you do first becomes a template. Well, hey, there's a template. We have been lucky or pushed enough to get a legally binding referendum as a result of a political difference. And we're heading right towards material difference county again, either with Brexit or the melee that follows. So actually, we're not anywhere near in as bad a situation as the poor Catalans are, although we will still have Prime Minister Rajoy to deal with, by the looks of it. Because if you remember, he was the one who tried to and did scare the bejesus out of a lot of people by saying that the Scots would never get into the EU. He backed the wrong horse. We are the Europeans. It's so ironic the way this has all worked out. If anyone cared about the ideals of Europe, well, there's 5 million people here who still want to join, but that's the very folk that he was trying to scare into, huckle into, shutting up, sitting back, and accepting the leadership of an isolationist, Little Englander society and government that will never become Europeans. So he's still there. We will have those difficulties. And actually, when I was mentioning that option of EFTA, sadly, he could have a say in that too. Because you can only become a member, becoming a member of EFTA will be straightforward for Scotland. They've all said that they want us in. The problem is getting into the EEA. And that has to be approved by the 4 members of EFTA and the 27, which means that there could be a veto from Spain again. But as far as I understand it, nobody expects that to be anything like as likely, because if the will of EFTA is that they've accepted a new member, then the expectation is the EU will not stand in their way. So that seems like a long set of stories about things that isn't what you came to hear tonight. I can. But the point is, you know, we can talk about all the other stuff, that's fine. But, you know, if we don't begin to get our peckers up and look around us at what is possible, then what are we actually pushing towards? It seems to me it's very important that we know where we're going. We don't just know where we're coming from. I have a stepdaughter who is one of these uncanny knacks of managing to hit a lot of very complex ideas in the head. And we were off learning to ski. I mean, I'm sure like many other folk, even though you're in the foothills of the skiing zone here, how many people can ski? I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Sorry, I'm not trying to be funny, but I mean, if we were in any other country that had even semi-regular snow about 40 miles away, we'd all be skiing, but anyway. And so, of course, like any good sort of Scot, I didn't know how to ski. So when I met my husband, and of course he could ski, and we had the two girls, they wanted to learn. So we went to France, got to the top of the hill. I must have been talking to somebody, and I didn't hear how to stop. So we all set off, and I thought, oh dear, I don't know how to stop here. I didn't know how to do the snowplow to stop. So I was kind of trying to watch other people, but they weren't at that point either. And then I could see right in front of me, at the end of the slope, there was a wee lassie playing. And I thought, oh no, and I was just heading straight towards her. So I was trying to do some moves, but I had no moves because I couldn't ski. So I was basically just heading straight towards her, counted before I hit her, dunted my head, got no sympathy. And then Rosie came up and said, weren't you listening when the instructor described how to stop? And I thought, see, this is a big life moment, honey. You know, you can get irresponsible adults as well, you know. I said, no, it wasn't actually. And she said, well, what he said was, you just need to look where you want to go, and your skis turn automatically. Where were you looking? And I don't know, at that moment I thought, wow, that is a mind-blowing thought, right? Because if you keep focusing on what you want to avoid, you will head straight towards it. What I had to do at that moment seemed counterintuitive. Although all that was worrying me was that lassie, I had to look away from her to where I wanted to go, and I would have been all right. And I think we're in the same boat. You can sit, and I know you will. We'll ask questions about the BBC, you can't do anything about it. We can ask questions about all sorts of things you can't do anything about. They're itches, people like to scratch itches, I get it. But if we don't get to a situation where we're turning around and beginning to see where we want to go, we will always be stuck in Britain. So I think it's incumbent, it may seem like this is all highfalutin talk, it might seem a wee bit distant and all the rest of it. This will be our new world. And already the connections are being made. Nicola was up talking at an Arctic Forum in Reykjavik. On Monday, 600 people from all over the Arctic are coming to an Arctic Forum in Edinburgh. On Sunday, if any of you are keen enough, there's a Nordic Horizons event with folk talking about Scotland's role in the Arctic and its future. The high north, the North Atlantic, is our home. It's always been our home. In the same way as we're lucky enough to have several identities. But we need to recognise the future's got a lot to do with those parts that we've never been taught about, that we are not wealthy enough to go and be able to spend much money in, that we cannot even buy a pint of lager in, right? But our future lies with their outlook, their background, their history, their confidence, and above all, their willingness to help. So that to me is kind of a reason for optimism, and I hope you feel the same too. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lesley. That's fascinating. We're going to have a break now. There's lots of tea and coffee and cake next door, and the idea then is for everyone to come back maybe in 20 minutes, and we'll have a question and answer session then. A couple of things. Lesley's actually got some copies of that book here, which are available, and Jason is here from the Indie app. Does anybody here not know what the Indie app is?
What's to say?
Yeah, the Indie app is an app for your phone.
My friend here has mentioned it. I'm just knowing not knowing anything about it.
Okay.
Explaining to me.
Yeah, well, Jason's here. If you want to have a word with him, he can explain all the fantastic new features that have just been built into the app as well. It allows everybody to connect with each other. There are groups all over the country. I'm not sure just how many now, Jason. 131. 131 groups across the country, all connected. So if you have any kind of event like the one we've had tonight, you can tell the whole of Scotland through one message. Lesley, I thought that talk was brilliant, and it was just when I was having a cup of tea there was something that you said that has answered the question I've had in my mind for the last year. How did Iceland possibly manage to beat England? But with 50% of the DNA coming from Scotland, that made a lot of sense. So, first question, Gordon's got a microphone, so...
Come on, don't be shy.
Yeah.
And you can ask about the BBC, right? You know, it's all right. Oh, there it goes.
I take it off the bottom of the mic stand. I just left the wire open.
That's all right, where you go?
Right. Topical question. What did you think of Alex's show on RT?
I've actually been so busy organising this Arctic Forum that I haven't seen it. I saw today there were a few problems with the tweets. Who saw it in here?
You.
Oh my gosh, right, okay. Well, actually, that's still about half, but I mean, that's more than RT has ever probably had, watching in Scotland at least. I don't know that I don't think it's such a great idea. I know myself, when I worked for BBC for a good while, and had a lot of arguments with them. I left basically because we just ended up having constant arguments about the content of what we were discussing. I mean, most of the way through the Iraq War, the production side were basically trying to discuss litter and dog shit because it got more people phoning up than the war that we were in the middle of. And that was partly because the BBC had bottled it if you remember, the dodgy dossier, Greg died walking the plank. That was the end of the BBC, seriously. That guy was great, much as he may have had different politics, all the rest of it. He was a bonny fechter, he really was for the Bee. And he believed in very vigorous journalism. And as soon as the Bee lost that battle with the government, it just pulled all its news and current affairs way, way, way inside the park. Never wanted to get close to the edge of that argument again. And I know, because I was working in Radio Scotland for that whole period, it was just constant arguments as you could begin to feel. It didn't even need edicts from London. This is not the way things work. People internalise. I just moved cats. I moved house and have 3 cats. If I'm nervous, they're nervous. This is how things work. You know, the folk staff at BBC Scotland just needed to get the vibe and just began to pull back enormously from things. So it was difficult to get very vigorous programmes going. I left and became an independent for about 1.5 or 2 years, and by gum did I learn pretty quickly how hard it is to do good programmes as an independent. And that was even when I had 20 years broadcasting experience, and the people I was working with had broadcasting experience. Now, I'm not trying to be funny, but it's very hard. You can talk about having radical, different programming, and you can always have a good launch programme because everyone puts the most energy they've got into their first programme. The 2nd, the 5th, the 22nd, the 30th. It's quite hard to keep that standard up. And I wonder, because I also think Alex is connected to the bid to buy this, well, to take over control of Johnson Press. This is Johnson Press that owns the Scotsman, as well as Scottish local papers, Yorkshire Post, a lot of titles in England. And as you may know, there's a Norwegian businessman who wants to take over the board and install Alex as chairman of the board. Now, I don't know, but I think that's, I mean, I know he's a bit of a superhuman, but I think that's enough for one lifetime, really. And making a go of that is really important, because I think the plan is to relocate Johnson Press headquarters as a company from England to Scotland. And what a brilliant thing that would be. We've seen so much going the other way. That's a really important thing to do. But if I was an employee of Johnson Press, or if I was a shareholder or something like that, I'm not a shareholder in anything except community energy companies, but, you know, I would be sort of wondering how much attention Alex would be paying when he's got to put so much energy into breathing life into that programme. So it wouldn't be my priority for him. My priority for him would be actually the Johnson Press thing. And I think that the RT thing will end up being an energy sink. And of course, there's a whole battery of people waiting for the first mistakes. The first tweets that quite obviously weren't sent by other human beings and were passed off as such. You know, the first time you take shortcuts, you've had it. People smell a rat, you know, and when you've gone through journalist training, you know you can't you know, there's lots of times we could have done shortcuts like that and never can succumb to that, because, you know, the audience can hear the same way as the cats know you're nervous. So I don't think it's a good move, but I haven't seen it. What do you think, folks? What do you think, Andrew?
I don't know what the fuss was about.
Sorry?
I don't know what the fuss was about, to be perfectly honest.
Which way? Either way?
Yeah, no, but I mean, the way you're sort of saying it's not good move from, and a lot of other people had said, you know, give it sort of negative impression. But when you saw the programme, it's not the right overweight, you know, I just don't see what the fuss was about.
Well, I think that's the problem. If you want to make a change or a difference somewhere, you have to figure out what, so I think, you have to figure out what skills you've got and what opportunities there are. And the thing that I've always admired Alex Salmond about is that he's been a very good gambler, I mean, in many respects. For example, I mean, the way that he created an energy revolution in Scotland was really very impressive. I know there's lots of people who don't like wind turbines, but we've moved to a situation where 7% of Scotland are pretty happy with renewable energy, and we're well on the way to being European leaders in this, actually. Of course, we need to match up the intermittent energy we've got with base load, which is what Iceland's got, for example. If we could connect that as a massive piece of engineering, it would be one of the most ambitious and forward-looking things we've ever done. And that started with Alex Salmond putting all his cards on that square. So I hugely admire that. But I think he's put all his cards in the wrong square here, because it's tempting. Television is seductive and empty and hollow. Believe me. For most people.
Is it long-term form?
I can't hear you. You just make me shut
Is it a long-term exercise, Marley, or is it short-term?
I don't know, but I mean, I really don't know. I was on his show that he did. Did people go to see his show in the Edinburgh Festival? It wasn't scintillating.
The one question I wanted to ask you, Lesley, you're around the marketplace quite a lot. You're talking all over the place. You must get a feel as to the mood of the country. Are we moving in the right direction to get independence? Are you getting any vibes from corners of the country that we could be making strides in that direction?
Well, there's sort of 3 levels to that. One is ourselves, the yesers, if you like. Astonishing. What are we like? We're still here. Dogged, too small a word. You know, it's extraordinary how tenacious the 45 have become. And look at you as well, I'm not trying to be funny, but earlier we were talking about Facebook and Twitter. You're all on social media now, practically. You know, we were talking about the Indie app. One gentleman was sort of bold enough to say, I'm not sure I can just exactly about that. 5, 10 years ago, would we have had that level of savvy about that? No, because we knew we had to get in there because we weren't really being represented in the mainstream media. So you don't know what muscles you've built. You know, as a group of people, the other thing is, you look at all sorts of community issues and whatever, and every time something has to be picked up and run with, it's yes people who are doing it. Because actually, once you've had to marshal your energies once collectively, it's not so difficult to do the same thing again. And actually, over time, that really makes quite a difference because everybody sees, I'm sorry to make these kind of analogies, because this might sound a little bit like Greg's sausage roll, but you are disciples. People judge the future Scotland on you as much as anything. And lots of people are beginning to get involved in lots of issues, which is great. Across Scotland, there are groups like you, and you're right, I'm lucky enough to see it. There was 150 a couple of weeks ago. There was an extraordinary week where there's about 150 turned up on a wet Monday afternoon, and their forward shop was the first one. I'm sure there's an argument about that, but it was opened in September the 19th, and they've been going ever since. You know, they're still plugging away. Denny, I mean, how many folk have been in Denny? Right, as many people as been in the blooming Faroe Islands, right? Look, Denny was absolutely stowed out in a Baptist church because the minister's a yeser. Dunbar, I'll get there last. Dunbar, exactly the same, you know, all of these areas, people are coming out in absolute droves. It is almost quasi-religious. Maybe it's because there's so many churches involved, but I mean, people have got a kind of, it's almost like a need to get reoriented to the scripture, slightly. So that's one thing. We are pretty there, although I don't think we're necessarily as organised as we could be. The Scottish Independence Convention should be doing some of that. It's not, partly because there's a bit of an argument about direction, and partly because it's got no money. So you can come back to that if you want. The other thing, though, is it doesn't really matter. It's good that we are pretty solid, but of course, that's not enough to get over the line. Well, it depends entirely at what point the referendum is held, because if we have EU nationals allowed to vote, if we have 16 to 17-year-olds allowed to vote, someone has calculated that if we get 90% of EU nationals voting yes, we would have been over the line last time. I think there's a pretty high likelihood that EU nationals will be voting yes this time, but who knows. Then there's the other group. This is the group that the recent Build conference that the SIC held was interested in and did some research about. The 15% of sort of switherers. And what they found that as actually you could take even from focus groups they did and so on, you could take even 20% of people who had voted no but were sort of open to things. And actually they were very open to the idea of independence, but they had a couple of things to say. One was, in fact the biggest one they had to say, was last time round, there were very tangible, some might say lies or assertions put forward by the no side. You will not get a pension. You will not, Vaseline will close, there will be all these jobs lost. These things will happen. But the response from the yes side tended to be more abstract. Scotland will be fairer. There will be social justice. We will be more equal. And what they were saying was, we want to hear an alternative plan with jobs related to it. And actually, that's not a bad point. I mean, as you may have got by now, I'm pretty motivated about energy, for example. If we controlled energy policy, you're damn right we would have got our interconnectors going. We would be talking to Norway directly now about joining up the European grid, the green grid that's being built in the North Sea. We'd be talking to the Icelanders. We'd be using the fibre optic cables coming down to fibre optic all our islands and go 4G from the north down. It's mind-blowing what we could be doing, and it's jobs, 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 all of it, and they're not shitty jobs. You know, they're good jobs. But we didn't tackle it this way necessarily, and the groups that were spoken to wanted to hear that kind of tangible achievements of independence this time. They've got that it'll be fairer and everything. I mean, my God, how could it not be? So we don't need to keep banging that drum. They've heard that bit. They also, they don't want, and neither people who voted yes don't want an immediate referendum. What was found was that people found the first one so upsetting at the point of losing it that folk are reluctant to go through that again unless it's a pretty good hope of winning it. And no folk did find it divisive. They do find now that there are, there's two sides in communities and so on, and that's true to an extent. So what the no people were saying was, when we've heard what Brexit's about, when we see what a mess they've made of it, when you've got a plan that's got numbers on it and jobs, come back, we're here. And that's kind of interesting. Another thing that they came up with was facts. Well, are obviously cheers that win a ding, but what is that? People don't regard facts as necessarily, okay, it's stuff that comes from the dreaded mainstream media, and it's probably important to rebut them, but all that does is bring you back to neutral. What people really rate is if their boss says to them, Brexit will be a disaster and half our jobs will be lost, that's a fact. That, in fact, seems to come up as the highest order fact you can have. And people seem to be a bit sort of inured to hearing more huge amounts of millions of pounds this way and millions of pounds that way. That didn't really move them. But if there was respected members of their lives or their communities who had strong opinions about it, they tended to regard that as fact. And you're the community. So there's a third thing. They tended to judge what an independent Scotland would be like on how well we are currently running public services. Now, obviously, there's been stuff that's come in on time and under budget, but there's also problems in the health service and in schools. I mean, we know there are. So people are looking at that, and I think they're making judgments not just on what level of problem there is, but what level of honesty there is about it. So that's something the movement can do nothing about. That is in the control of the SNP, and of course you could make the argument that you can't start to shift big pots of money when all the levers are elsewhere and you haven't got control of them. But actually, sometimes there are just arguments about what's being done, and that's hard always to just say it's white and white's black. So those are the things people had found. Now, that was a statistically representative group of people that took some time to find, and the object is to keep trying to find out what they think a bit more. But if all those things are right, then actually the Scottish Government has got a lot to do, and it's hard, no matter how much the other groups like Commonweal has got an alternative white paper. Lots of people have published books about currencies, but until the Scottish Government puts a stamp on something and decides what tilt it's going to take, it won't have the shape of a plan. And I don't know if the SNP are listening to any of our findings or not. So it's hard to know. And of course, people feel like they should be out doing stuff, should be out personally in barricades or whatever it is, or on stalls, and possibly that's quite good. Actually, people still see you're there. That doggedness is not nothing. But I think also the SIC should be actually supplying people with a bit more in the way of daily rebuttals. You do get such constant arguments, and I don't think we are putting out a different independence perspective, because the SNP is trying to prove it's doing the day job. Well, if it wants to do the day job, that's fine, and I can see the point in that. But actually, it could let somebody else have a little bit of space and a bit of cash to do the other one, And so far, that's not forthcoming. Long answer, short questions. But what do you think?
No answer.
But what do you think?
Well, I'm a bit of a I'm sort of glasses half full. And I'm very optimistic, because we started I think in the last referendum was about 8%, and we ended up at 45%. It was a fantastic achievement. And I think we lost it because you touched on the economy. I hope in addressing that, let's talk about having the bank. It is something really positive. Talk about the electricity grid, having your own company to keep prices at a good level. That's also positive stuff. And I think that the SNP, by and large, are doing a fairly decent job in Scotland with all the positive things they're doing, with prescription charges, tuition fees, and yeah, they have trouble with the health service. But you can't keep reducing budgets and spending the same and achieving the same. And that happens in education as well. So they're sort of moving money around and they're not getting all the money they should be getting. And my argument to people I've talked is, look what we're doing. What could we do if we had all the cash?
Yeah.
God knows before I leave this mortal coil, we'll be independent.
Right, and then we've got to have a woman asking a question next.
It was possibly connected with the last question that during the Yes campaign in 2014 there was a huge groundswell of young people getting very actively energised by the debates. How that came about, nobody is really sure, I don't think. Possibly social media going that way, but where are they tonight?
Well, let's face it. I mean,
Or-
would you, when you were 16, would you spend your night with a bunch of old fogies like us? You know.
Yeah, but if they were here, we'd be old folks.
Yes, but the thing is, because power is an aphrodisiac, right? For the, as maybe Alex has said it, you know, for the 10 hours of that vote in 2014, Scotland held the power. All of us held the power to determine Scotland's fate. Now that gets people going. That's not a wee makey-uppy. That's not a we'll get a result if England votes differently. That's not a there'll be a coalition and then we'll wait and see who agrees with whom. That's a complete yes-no. That's why men get excited about football. It's a result. You know, in 90 minutes, something happens. And by a finite period, there was a result. I'm not surprised that, you know, young people could get very excited and all of that because there was a focus, there was a length of time, and then it finished. And it was powerful. Powerful propositions attract everybody into it because you know that you've got a crucible of power and you're going to be part of it. This difficult period is the kind of long wait in some respects, and that's why I think we should be using this to get organisationally stronger. I mean, I was it last night even in the Tayport, in a pub in Tayport with a bit of Yes North East Fife. I was suggesting to them that maybe they should be trying to get a Yes Fife group together. And I've got to say, people are bland. But you speak to other people in Fife. And I was going, well, yeah. This is a problem actually about our so-called local government. You know, Fife is massive. Fife is the size of a small principality. And it is big. But we maybe need to think of trying to get regional connections going at one level, because the pan-Scottish stuff is so big, it's hard to have proper events. You know, the Build event that we have in Edinburgh had 2,000 people at it. There was no interactivity at all. You know, if we had regional events, I think we could start doing little bits of training stuffing. We could start trying to think how you map your communities. I mean, don't we think we need to know eventually if we have a champion for independence on every street in Scotland? And if we do we know that? And if we don't, how are we going to find it out? You know, I just think this is a time for, you know, that mending the roof while the rain's not on, whatever that terrible Cameron analogy was. That doesn't answer your question, does it? The kids, yeah. But the other thing is, young people need to have the power to control something, I think. If I don't know, but if you could have a kind of, if the younger lot here were able to decide what they want and who they want to speak, it wouldn't be me. Of course, it might not be anybody remotely connected to independence either, but, you know, you'd have to just give them, I think, give them the power to decide and shape meetings where they want it, when they want it. But I don't know, what do other people think?
My son's 25 and he is just fed up with elections.
Oh yeah, can you use the mic?
Sorry, sure.
I say my son's 25, so that's always 21 then when we had the referendum. We've had elections in Scotland, many of them, every 7 of them or something in that time. And his generation, he says, we're trying to get on with our life. You've left us a crap world. You've made it very hard for us to buy a house or find a home when we're just starting out at our age. We haven't got enough time and bandwidth to do any more politicking for you for just now. But we're here when you need us. When it happens, we'll come back. But we've got to get on with our lives now. It's just one example from a 25-year-old who was 21 at the time.
Jason, are you stirring at the back? Someone with a ponytail that has got much grey in it?
Yeah, it's strictly, I think, I don't know, can you hear me?
No.
Well, I think myself have gone around the country as well, is that I think it all depends on the campaign. I think everything happens when we campaign, because in Scotland, we've spent the last 300 years in Pop Scotland with us, and you talk, and then you fall out. You don't fall out, because, well, I fall out, it doesn't really make any difference, but then you go home, and then you come back, and that's it. Whereas last time, the first time that we ever did it was this campaign, you know, and it mattered. And we had people coming into the shop a week to go. Right, okay, son, tell me about it. You know, I need to know. I've got to do this thing. And a lot of people just came to it too late. So, young people, old people, people that had not really considered independence at all, it happened when it was a real campaign and there was a real decision going to happen, and people had to get ready for it. And that's what's going to happen this time. And my only fear about this is that we don't get a campaign in time to remember all the lies that we were told at the last campaign. And to have the same people who came into all the yes shops, you know, with 3 weeks to go, or a week to go, or 2 weeks to go, too late, but they're in the lobby. You know what I mean? They made the mental decision to come towards and listen to the arguments. And once somebody makes those mental decisions, they're yesers. It's just a question of time. And we didn't have enough time last time, but all those people are still in the lobby. They self-identify as no voters because they voted no last time, but they actually aren't. They came in and they started to engage in the conversation. And that's what I would say. It's about getting the campaign. We get the campaign, we win it. In the meantime, between getting the campaign in, we need to organise. We need to just learn all the lessons from the last campaign and sort it out. It's not difficult, but we just need to do it, you know. So that's what I would say with young people, everybody, it's the same problem.
Other survey work that we've done by Craig DL was showing that if there had been the same level of turnout in working class Scotland, we would have won. And that was, people did lots of work in, you know, the Radical Independence campaign particularly, but lots of people did lots of work in Castlemilton and the big places in Glasgow. But on the day, it was very hard to get those people out. What folk were beginning to think, like Craig, was that you can't just be instrumental about this, as in you pop up a week to go and you're everybody's pal. I'm your pal, I want you to vote yes. You know, I'll tell you whatever, you know, it can't be worse in Britain, come on, it's got to be better. And folk are a bit, that's kind of like, you know, a wee flash in the pan, you're coming along now, you're just like the rest of them, a wee bit. And also, okay, so I'm going to register. Folk have long memories of the poll tax. There's a lot of folk who've just dipped right off everything, because it's just better that way, especially if you're at work in a deprived area. You just keep your heads down, it's a kind of cash economy, and you don't try to get markers on you from the state. So, you know, people would say they would vote, and maybe you even managed to register them or get them to sign stuff, still weren't going to do it. So again, we didn't maybe work through well enough. The people who have direct experience of that, I've spoken to some of them, maybe you all have, feel quite strongly that there were issues there. Well, if it takes longer to be active in these areas, some folk should just be getting active a bit now, and it might have to be about stuff that's not ostensibly to do with independence, but about the kind of problems people have. And I guess that's actually happening. The universal credit kind of protests there have generally been by yes people, but it probably needs more specific engagement on that front as well. So there's a lot to do, and it's a little bit frustrating that we haven't really got quite as practical as we should yet. That's my only. I agree with you on that, Jason.
Can I just say something? Our children, who range from 21 to 45 years old, they're very suspicious of politicians. They've grown up and listened to all sorts of politicians say things that have never materialised. And in fact now, in the last couple of months, we're looking at a Conservative government which is quite prepared to tell lies and do anything it can to survive. The point about having a constitution which is written down and which is legally binding on a government and which can't be changed without proper debate and proper democratic vote, in their opinion, is the way forward for them. Where a politician like Theresa May can't stand up one day and say one thing and the next week change the policy completely. So I do think that one way that we could look positively on the future is now, as Iceland did, communicate with the population, get the ideas about what they'd like to see in the constitution, and actually put it down on paper and commit the Scottish government to follow that. That's just the opinion.
Sure. Actually, the last meeting we had in Nordic Horizons had Katrin Rodsdottir, who is the secretary of the Icelandic Constitutional Council. They are the guys who did this crowdsourced constitution. It's quite interesting. It has clauses in it. It's taken a bit from the Ecuadorian constitution, which basically says that the land itself has rights, the earth has rights. And that's quite a funky idea. Not that it sort of immediately lets you know what the earth's rights are too, but simply that lawyers have to argue the toss, and the earth in itself has got rights which can't be taken away from it by humans. So this is really mind-blowing stuff, and it didn't get passed because they involved the populace in it. They basically were elected. There's 99% of Icelanders use Facebook, so they just basically used Facebook to elect a council. There were 470 people put themselves forward to be on it. That's how keen everyone was. They chose 25, were elected. They spent 5 months on it. They put this thing together. They gave it to the politicians who'd been excluded from the process, and the politicians went, right, so meanwhile back in real politics, they just completely ignored it, timed it out, and they're now waiting. There's been an election in Iceland, and they're waiting to see the outcome as to what coalition comes together. If it's red-green, there might be a chance they'll adopt it. If it's the Independence Party, unfortunately named because it's very right-wing, they probably won't. But, and it's certainly a great exercise to go through, but it really depends. It matters hugely that lots of people are involved. The very first thing they did before they had that vote on Facebook, they randomly selected about 100 people from the phone book, absolutely randomly, to come in and give their opinions. That's how strong a belief they have in their own capacity. Scotland is bedeviled by a class divide, and even more than that, a professional sniffiness about the capacity of ordinary people. It is a top-down society where those and such as those think it's their prerogative to go off and write constitutions in a room somewhere with experts, and the rest of us will all be terribly respectful and impressed because they are the tablets of stone personified. And we've changed. If that was ever true, and it seems it might have been true in this country, we've changed. That's not good enough. I don't think it is. Alex Salmond was going to draw up a constitution in 5 weeks flat, you may not remember, in the summer of 2014, with experts in a room, just flying in the face of modern examples all over the Northern Hemisphere of people being much more involved in creating constitutions. There's one wee caveat to all of this. You've got to keep updating them, otherwise you get Catalonia. I'm sure the Catalans would wish that they'd never adopted a constitution in 1978, because that was done effectively by force, by those parties, the PP particularly, who were effectively the descendants of Franco. Franco just died. He didn't get defeated. And his thinking lives on. So the 1978 Constitution has been a massive handicap for them, because it needs all sorts of levels of support from the whole of Spain to alter that one clause in it, that Spain is an indivisible unit. So unless you've got the frisky kind of society that's either going to be in and it's going to be open to adjusting something so that it basically grows with you, you're creating a straitjacket if you're in a society that isn't prone to amending itself. I'd like to think the Scots are going to be that kind of society, but I don't know, the Catalan thing has really struck me very forcibly. Just right now, I'm not sure I want a constitution written, because we think like British people with kilts on. It's not good enough. We're not good enough yet in our heads, in our imaginations. We can, of course, we say we're not good enough. We could construct something that would be a pretty good start. But could we get to the stage where we would confidently just randomly select people from Scotland from the phone book? Because we should be. We should be having working class people in, we should have disabled people in, we should have all sorts of folk who are normally excluded should be writing that constitution, and stick a lawyer in, aye. But you know, we need to change dramatically who gets to say how we shape society. And I don't think that we have yet got over this undue respect for professionals, which is actually a huge limiting factor in how vigorous a democracy can be. Right, let's go everyone going.
Just picking things up from there, it seems to me that some of the bits of our country where that is beginning to happen and change are places where there are now community land trusts where there have been buyouts. You know, to visit Egg, which I know you know extremely well, to get a sense of some of that. To what extent do you think it's important to make more progress with land reform in a general sense, in terms of laying the ground for the change that we want to see? Because it seems to me we can't afford to just sit and hope that more of it will happen, or there will be something that we'll do a lot more of once we are independent. I sense that it's something pretty fundamental in terms of laying the ground for a successful and a much less class-dominated society in the future.
Sure. Well, we've just seen a great example when the Scottish Government took on a vested interest in the form of the alcohol industry. Nobody said they could get minimum pricing through. Everybody was sceptical, but they took that to the highest courts in Europe and then to the UK Supreme Court, and they won. I want to see the Scottish Government do the same with landowners. I know there's an issue legally that we've left this problem to fester for so long that we've entered an era of human rights. So the right to property might be something landowners can use to try to fend off any really serious attempts to change the most ludicrously concentrated form of land ownership in the developed world. But if that's true, take them on. I would like to see the Scottish Government go all the way with something adventurous and bold, because it would tell people who are living in fiefdoms, which is what's happening up the Angus Glens as well, that there is some hope, and there's dry land on the other side. As things stand, it's no surprise that so many areas that have got big landowners voted no, because the landowners partly made it clear by letters that they expected that vote, and partly didn't need to, because it was perfectly obvious. And people who are gillies or working on the land are dependent so much on landowners still. We're only just post-feudal. We only abolished feudal tenure 15 years ago, less than that. We think it's such a long time. It's not, it's shamefully short. So in lots and lots of places, it's still the case that the landowner is the landlord, the employer. Okay, they're not the feudal superior anymore, and not many of them are the convener of the local council, but they have clout. And if you don't create a vibrant, positive, functioning, alternative way to have land in Scotland, you'll always have people who might think they would like to live in a land where you could do what you want and vote as you think. But no, they're not living there because nobody cared enough to risk political capital and their own reputations to change something that is a scourge of this country. I feel so strongly that this is true. And we hardly even know actually what we would become when you get to the stage that the things you've only dreamed about could be happening in your lifetime. And I know because I've seen it. The people on Egg were like that. Nobody believed they could possibly do anything except just couldn't be used on his island. And it took 8 long years of organisation, but they passed out to the other side. And the thing, the society they've been able to create is something nobody could have imagined. And they have their strongest achievement is their own children live there, not because they have to, but actually in some ways they do. Because where else but Egg could you build a 2-bedroom house for £40,000? That's what you can do on Egg. Because they're giving plots of land free to young people. This comes back to your power thing. That's powerful. They're giving those plots of land free to young people to build their own houses, using sweat labour. They all help build each other's things. And if they then go on to sell the house ever on the open market, at that point they've paid back the full cost of the land to the Isle of Egg Trust, who do the same thing all over again with somebody else. It's genius. And nobody told them how to do that. They figured it out themselves. That's what people do when they end up understanding they've got power. They do some incredibly smart things. Unfortunately, that's probably not, is that my bag? That's behind me. Somebody's got a persistent phone problem. So anyway, that, to me, that gives you a strong indication. I mean, some of the Egg Acts were the most, you know, when people feel that they've got their dignity's been taken from them, and they know that their noses are being rubbed in it. And when people know they have to accept that, it really breaks them. And it creates a lot of pessimism, a lot of drinking, an awful lot of stuff that's problematic. And then when you see people slowly beginning to kind of get their heads up, because they did stuff together, you can hardly believe you're seeing it. But the other thing the Egg Acts did, they managed to put a big grant in and got electricity together. They used to be working on diesel. Every house hummed slightly because there was diesel generators keeping everything going, the most polluting, expensive way to keep going. So electricity is now an off-grid system joining up hydro, solar and wind, and has meant that they hardly have any fallback whatsoever. Each house has got a trip on it, so if you use more than 5 kilowatts, you trip your house. And you have to pay 50 quid to be put back on the system. And to date, in 6 years, one person's done it. And what that means is they're keeping a cap on their energy usage. They become a truly green island. It was once through necessity, it's now by choice. So they don't have utility rooms. They have the Isle of Egg Building Cooperative, which builds different types of houses without utility rooms, because people are not really expected to have a great battery of white goods. All of this is possible. It's possible everywhere. It's possible right here, but it's only possible when people own land. Sorry.
It was interesting to hear you talking in the first half about all the positive things we can do, and it just seems it's very easy to slip back into negative again, and here we are talking about some negative things. But this little card I've got in front of me says, read the news you're not getting. if we're going to get all of these positive ideas out, how are we going to do it on a national scale if we don't have the support of the press? How do we overcome this? Because it seems to me that within the press, if it's Scottish, it's bad. Then if it's bad, well, it's just sort of got to be Scottish. There's a lot of this is going on at the moment. We can't get over this hurdle. How do we tackle that?
Well, it is a massive biggie, actually. Although I'm not a believer in that we just have to put a kind of veneer on things that are problematic. I mean, land is problematic, and the SNP have not tackled it properly.
Sure,
sorry. But yes, I mean, one start, I was speaking earlier to folk, and we were just talking about, well, the fact that the Daily Mail in our culture is basically a virus. It's a virus that pulls all the other press to the right, because when it creates one part of the spectrum, it means that it pulls the spectrum over to the right. The BBC, having lost its bottle, takes a lot of its editorial cues from newspapers, and then has to think that things like the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, even the Sun, are somehow representing a kind of mainstream, where in fact, there was some folk here from Germany earlier, they're just aghast at the thought that this is in any way regarded as anything except what it is, extremely right-wing vested interests. I was speaking to somebody who said that Lord Rothermere, who owns a large section of papers, was actually a Remainer, until the advertising departments told them that every time they put on a story about immigrants and about taking back control and all that stuff, the advertising click rate went up because people were coming on those stories in droves and clicking on every advert on the side of them. And he changed his tune, despite knowing it would be a disaster for Britain. So we've got a huge problem with our press, and it's very hard to see how that'll change. That's why, personally speaking, the Scotsman is not a bad thing, a project in the short term to be really trying to get on with. I don't think the plan is for it to become an independent supporting paper if there is that takeover, but simply for it to be doing good journalism again, which would be fine, and to have resources put back in it. Perhaps when there's a referendum, it will declare itself one way or t'other, and it will be a bit more surprising than you might think. But the National is already in the position of being a pro-independence paper, so that would be a good move to start. As far as the BBC is concerned, if you start to have more papers that are beginning to pull where the mainstream is in Scotland over a bit, you pull everything. It's like pulling this thing over here. I can pull the whole damn lot over just by this corner. So in practical terms, I would say the Scotsman is far more important to Alex Salmond than RT. And the BBC is hard to do stuff with. It's got a new controller, Donalda McKinnon, who's actually quite a reasonable woman. It's got some dinosaurs in charge of news. She will have her work cut out trying to do anything with them, but they're fully aware that they screwed up last time. They just don't intuitively know how to get out of it, because there is no, I was going to say no education. I'm quite appalled a lot of the time at the number of people who are in very important positions in Scotland who actually don't even know particularly very much about Scotland. They're well socialised, they've been at university, they know how to speak, properly, and they can kind of talk social media. But being educated about your own country, being curious, just that, being curious, that's being dinned out of people. It's not seen as a particularly useful thing to have. And all of that needs leadership. It needs real, vigorous leadership. I mean, why have we not got somebody, why have we not got foreign correspondents from BBC Scotland? Why have we not got a foreign correspondent in Catalonia? Of course, because that would look like a pro-independence gesture, wouldn't it? But until we start to get some moves like that, we're still way, way off beam. I tried to set up a public service radio alternative to Radio Scotland about 5 years ago with a guy who could count. We actually approached Barra Media, who run most of the independent radio in Scotland. They rebroadcast most of their music on medium wave, and it's not much cop. It's not a very good medium for music. So we proposed that we would buy the medium wave frequencies off Bauer, And if we'd been able to, we would have had an instant network because they broadcast all over Scotland. Sadly, they at that point, and this was before the crash, they said that the company had a policy of not selling assets, and there was an interesting proposal, but they had no intention of doing it. And we got no support from the Scottish Government. I spent 18 months on that, not doing that again. So somebody's got to decide in the Scottish Government whether they want to support people who are trying to set something else up. And I don't know if they will. Long answer, but what do you think?
Well, it seems to me that there's an education problem to get over whichever issue you're talking about. And there's no mechanism for getting the positive benefits out to people. Because at the end of the day, we want people to vote for independence. And they've got to be motivated. They've got to want to do it. And unless they are aware of the positives for them, they're not going to be inclined to vote. So they have to be sort of educated in a way. It seems a bit crass to say that, but we've got to get a better quality message across, not to the converted, not to people like us. We've got to get it across to people who need to be converted. And it has to be very, very positive about the future of an independent Scotland. And I don't see how we're going to do this on a national scale if it's only one or two small activist groups. This has got to be something that the mainstream media's got to change for us to be able to do this.
Could I, sorry, just intervene there? One of the ideas that we came up with, we haven't implemented it yet, but we're looking for a suitable site. The idea is to create a poster which counters one of the main arguments that the Daily Mail or somebody was coming out during the week. It may be the taxation of North Sea oil, for instance, where you can produce a graph showing what the UK tax take is versus Norway's tax take. The sort of stuff that ordinary people will never see. But the idea is that we'll create a poster and have that in 3 or 4 of the key places, say in Blairgowrie, Cooperangus, Alyth, Meagle, so people passing might just stop and take in a counter message. And if everybody across the country did that, slowly but surely, hopefully the referendum's no more than a year away, but it gives us 50 posters of an opportunity to try to convert people if we did that.
But
That was just one idea we came up with.
People, like Lesley said earlier on, they have to perceive that as being a fact. It's relevant themselves.
Yes.
And if it's a good fact, they'll run with it. But if it's a negative fact, I'm going to know. And that's what will happen.
The design
It's
has
just
to be
this
very,
ability to
very
get this message across on that sort of scale.
Honestly, life is not, there are black and white keys on a piano. Nobody trusts all happy clappy. I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying. But I mean, another finding I think maybe everybody found was that the last time round, the suggestion there would be no problems at all with independence. Nobody expects that to be true. So, there has to be some line shade in all of this. And there has to be, I think you're quite right, this idea of trying to keep up with where the debate is at. That's why what I would like to have seen the SIC doing is getting some money from somewhere, but equally the SNP's war chest, then it needs to be from some crowd-funded sources or whatever, to be able to get somebody to be able to shove out a daily rebuttal actually, or just daily picking up of whatever story's going around. You use it as you want. There was a meeting recently of the Yes hubs in Cooper actually, and there was 14 hubs that came there. A lot of them are actually putting stuff like that up in their front windows, taking a lot of the salt art down actually, so that people can just come up, have a look at, they see people crossing the road to see what's up today once you've started it. You could then go a step further and get onto digital formats, because what could easily be done, let's learn from Corbyn. I mean, what he did was have lots of short videos. In fact, there was I can't remember the young guy, going back to the youth thing again, the young guys were easily able to produce videos with strap lines, so that actually you can be reading it, or you can read it when you're in a crowded place. You can still be seeing what the message is without hearing the audio. if you wanted to do that, lots of these Yes Hubs were actually talking about putting big TV screens up and just keep running the videos on a loop. There's one guy who would be excellent doing that. Oh no, I've had a senior moment. Yep, I've had a total senior moment. I can see him in my mind's eye and I can't remember his name. But anyway, he works for the National now. He was a Green candidate and he's excellent at doing these videos. I just like to get some money, poach him, get a little news hub together, start churning it out. So it's not taking over a TV channel, but it is getting all sorts of media out there and involving all sorts of young people, because they can all do this standing on their heads. I find it frustrating because I think that's what the SIC should be doing, but it's not everybody's idea of what it should be doing.
Was the question of funding, was it a serious question that was addressed by the SNP?
Yeah.
It was, and the outcome was a rejection, was it?
It was a funding formula which wouldn't work for any of the other groups. I can say no more, I'm afraid.
And what would be your estimate of the amount that the SIC could usefully use in this way per month or?
Well, it wouldn't take. I think if you could get 50,000 quid together, you could get 1.5 members of staff, and you could be basically pumping out this kind of stuff on a, first of all, a weekly basis. Make sure you can do it properly, move it to daily. I mean, some of us did a thing called Referendum TV that nobody watched during the, hello, you're the one of the 2,000 that watched it, okay, 2. Jason on a bad day, right, 3.5. But, what we could be doing is you get a format like that worked, and actually there's another example of how hard that is for Alexander to make it live, because it was hard for us to make it live. We were at the one moment trying to be controversial, to be interesting, but also appealing to no voters, potentially. So how does that all work? We actually had on quite a few Labour people just to try to get, and this is what I mean, in the end, what I'm interested in is not really propaganda. It's decent journalism that takes its field much wider and more inquisitively than anybody's really doing at the moment. And that's what we tried to do with Pat Caney, McWhirter, myself, Sarah Beattie-Stone, and we did quite a bit of stuff, we learned stuff, but we could be doing that in theatres around Scotland on a rolling basis if we had the organisation. But I am not doing this myself. I'm knackered.
Yes, I have a question. It's possibly for Gordon as well, because he knows about these things. What's to stop having a streaming channel, a radio streaming channel?
Has somebody got cold in here or something? Say that again and point the mic at your face.
What's to stop setting up a streaming channel, a radio streaming channel?
Well, we could. It's kind of touch and go as to whether enough people would pick that up that are sort of undecided. It's the beauty of trying to get a medium wave frequency like Bauer would be that you would be targeting absolutely everybody that's going around in transit vans around Scotland. And, again, without it being propaganda, you would be able to put a reasonable speech mix in that people would hear what they wanted to. It's perfectly possible to do a streaming thing, but I mean, for me, personally, that moment passed. I don't know if you've put your life and soul into something for a period and then discovered Aussies nowhere behind you. It's a scunner, so it needs somebody who's got a bit more energy, because personally speaking, I'm not doing that again. But if anybody younger with a bit of energy and, hips that function, wants to, get their teeth into something like that, then some oldie like me can be cranked out to advise, be delighted. Where are they? If anybody wants to set up a streaming radio service, let's do it. Yeah, this is the same with everything. There's a lot of local energy, and it could be the transformation of Scotland, the way this is happening, because actually the strength is local, really. And the Yes campaign the last time was so dreadful centrally that everybody was waiting for the message, the merchandise, the leadership to emerge. It didn't. So actually, that moment of realisation occurred where everyone realised that cavalry wasn't coming. And actually, you just have to get on with it yourself. And it probably was the making of Scotland, actually, that people began to get really powerful local identities together, even in the midst of these ludicrously large council areas that we're in. But if we could manage to do things and pull it together, this is where my interest in regional things comes in, because you could easily set up one proper regional streaming radio if you could decide what region you're in. Perthshire, Angus, Dundee and Angus and Perthshire. Possible. But how many of you are going to listen?
I think we're talking ourselves down a wee bit here, I think. So much of the inverted commas enemy that we're facing don't exist. The structure isn't there anymore. And so, on the other side of it too, is that we didn't have a yes movement. We didn't have a grassroots at the beginning of the last referendum. We have a grassroots right now. We are organising, but we exist. And we didn't exist last time. So, it's that stuff that you need to take into consideration when the next campaign happens. A lot of the things that you were talking about with the Constitution, that's why having the Constitution as a question at the moment, the Yes campaign last time, the 26% or whatever it was of us that were Yesers before the campaign started, went out and convinced and educated and taught the 45% enter. That's how it happened. It wasn't the BBC didn't convert anybody for us. We didn't have radio, we didn't have television, we didn't have anything. We did it ourselves. And this time we're at 45%. So we just need to go out and use the campaign as an education event, However long it is, use that to educate people around us. I mean, there's business plans that are predicated around events, that's how you get something started, an event, and the campaign is the event. That's how you get everybody interested, taking you seriously, listening to what you're saying, instead of just thinking you're just another political nutter that goes on and on and on about this. This is when people listen during the campaign. So I think it's not going to be the same campaign that we had last time. We've come leaps and bounds. How many people trust the BBC, really trust the BBC the way they did before? That's gone. So we're starting at a much higher base than we did then, and we nearly did it. Very just. So I'm very confident in this. I don't think there's anything to be down about. I just think that we need to learn the lessons that we picked up at the last one and act on them and get organised. And be ready for when the campaign is called. That's it.
I think there's probably a distinction to make. I mean, you're absolutely right. Come with the hour, come with the energy, come with the focus, come with all kinds of things. And that's absolutely true about the campaign. But Scotland is kind of weak in its civic institutions, actually, because we've been quite party-led for a long time. We've been quite top-down. We're a part of Britain, I'm afraid. And actually, the most that people can imagine is being a bit better than England at stuff. Because how would you think otherwise if you haven't lived abroad? It's a shocker when you do go and spend any time abroad and you come back and just think, that's not good enough. Being a couple of percentage better at England at stuff, that's crap. So somewhere in the civic scheme of things, we need to develop that muscularity that the Icelanders easily have, where they are, even if they get the brush off by politicians, they're hanging on the back of that thing they're going to get that blinking constitution through. And actually, the speaker that came over said, the way it's getting through is that even though it hasn't been adopted, strangely, it's guiding all the political decisions that are being made. It's as if it has been adopted because it was so discussed and so sort of understood. So there's two distinct things. Of course, you're right. When the campaign comes, we'll all get on the horse. But the thing is, we have, the strength of the bairn, as in the new country that will be born, is very related to the strength of the mother. And this period we're in, this is the kind of 9 months. We need to have that bairn pretty much born, hitting the ground running, And I think the work we do now on ourselves, unpacking a lot of the deference we've had for decades and centuries, unpacking a lot of the unfairness we never dreamed we could ever shift, learning to trust one another, not just with sharing our views, but sharing aspects of our lives, and moving forward with these different ways of owning things and different types of projects. If you're a part of something that you suggested, for example, like trying to do a streaming thing, okay, it's not going to be the campaign, but it's going to be the beginning of developing a little bit of muscle, a little bit of light lifting, because we're going to do some heavy lifting. So my interest in all these things is to get us into a better shape to be a patient almost. Sorry, you can see I'm a woman with a hip replacement operation coming up. You've got to, there's nothing much you can do. The surgeon's in charge, but you can be the best patient you can be. And we need to be the best civic Scots we can be, because that's the bit we can do now. So all of that needs us to start behaving and expecting different things, and expecting different things of politicians. We're not going to be a situation where a party's going to lead us with no other say in it again. We're never going to be in a situation where one leader of a party can decide to have a shared currency without even discussing it with his cabinet, which is what happened. Now, much as you're, many of you, no doubt, all of you are members of the SNP, people can kind of see there needs to be air in the room. We need to have more cooperation. So that's I think if we become independent-minded people, we will become independent. Yep. Last in the front.
Just to widen the audience a bit, do you ever get the opportunity, or have you ever invited into colleges and universities, say for students that were studying politics, economics?
No.
What's the reason why not? Because you're not a member of a political party, so I thought you might be invited in. And
no, I think they're still very nervous. I mean, this is the difficulty in Britain about politics being seen as a kind of disease, or a kind of set of biases or prejudice. It's not that, we have a civic society and you would be taught how to be a citizen. I mean, let's face it, we're not citizens, we're subjects. So an awful lot flows from politics being still a kind of bit of a, feels like a bit of a marginal thing. So sure, I mean, universities and schools, there's very, very few of them are courageous enough to say we should be expanding our thinking on that. I can do this whole talk without even mentioning independence. This is just an interesting thing to talk about. Nordic nations, for example. But I'll never get to do a programme about that anywhere because I'm biased now. As soon as you put your head over the parapet, you cannot be used anymore as a kind of unbiased filter. But it's a shame. I think, once we get back into campaign mode, there's got to be everybody who's working in schools and so on, some of this thinking and discussion has to happen now. I mean, let me ask you guys. I was in Shetland before the Snap election, and there was one school in Wales that had a hustings, with the kids in it, which was kind of amazing actually, and they let the public in. But I mean, did you have that here at your school? Schools? Right. Well, the thing is, you might not see arguing for a hustings in a Snap election with the dreaded Theresa May in charge as being anything to do with independence. But if you wouldn't even have an argument, a hustings for that, you're never going to have the second independence referendum will be a tougher jump to make. There needs to be an attempt to get discussion about all sorts of politics that isn't the big scary one before it comes along, because if you don't get the habit going, that feature's broke.
Yeah, I was just thinking, university students that are studying economics and politics, surely they've got speakers coming in from all sorts of areas, no?
Yeah, but I'm not professor something or other, am I? I'm not even a doctor or anything. So, you're asking me personally. But yeah, it's difficult because, yes, you're quite right. If you were able to see that there's no, there are shades of grey and there are different opinions that make up, in fact, that's what the whole of academia should be about, is understanding that there is no single fact, but lots of different perspectives. Yes, of course, there should be lots of different voices in there, but these institutions are part of the establishment. It's unlikely that they're going to be flinging the doors open anytime soon. I would say, however, that one notable exception has been Glasgow University, that actually has, I've done 2 or 3 talks about Blossom and stuff in Glasgow University, and I think Anton Muscatelli is a very fair-minded guy, who is their principal. I say no more.
Did you win any over?
Sorry?
Did you win any of your audience over?
Well, I don't know. I don't go at the end saying, hey, you, did you get, did you get healed?
Make this the last question.
Yeah, I just want to point something out. Just what you just said there, my daughter works for a private school, that's run by the Christian Brethren, and they had a debate on independence with the independence referendum within that school. So it does happen, it wouldn't happen in state schools. I was a teacher in the state school, it never happened, but it did happen in that school.
Did you say you used to work in the state schools?
Yes.
So why wouldn't it happen in state schools?
They would never allow it. The authority would never allow it. Even if the head teacher wanted to do the authority would stand down. This was an independent school and they did the debate. My daughter was actually a no voter until she didn't listen to me. Once that debate started, she was given the job of speaking to the Yes campaign, so she researched it. Once she researched it, then she changed to Yes.
That's interesting.
No, it did happen in
Well, we did have schools that what happened is the no voting, the people who were supposed to speak for the no
Didn't turn
pulled
up.
out in the last minute. And then the school said, well, we can't have it.
Yes.
And that was a policy that we did. So the next thing that happens, we have to, if they don't turn up to discuss it, the discussion happens anyway. And that we have to somehow make that the norm, because it would.
Sure, but I think as with all things, a template is something people just tend to copy. If you create a useful habit, then the next big thing that comes in gets treated the same way. Everything, there should be debates and all sorts of stuff happening now, to your point, about stuff that's not as scary as independence. Because once you get the habit of bringing people across the threshold, you'll be able to debate that habit. But if you can't even debate, the general election or Brexit.
The key is that 16-year-olds were voting school kids, were voting, therefore they're actually going into the school. And that's what happened, that's how they refused before. But because 16-year-old school kids were voting in the referendum,
with all due respect, I didn't find that at all. The last time around I did one thing in a school in Boyne, and I've got to say it's the scariest experience of my life actually. What was happening around the place, for sure, 16 and 17-year-olds were voting, so the schools were going, oh my God, we've got to do something about it. But what they were tending to do was debates from a standing start. No education, no researching it. They just, one day, they had a debate. And so it just took all the prejudice of what the kids had got from home, there was no run-up to it, and they ticked the box. Thank God we've done it. That's not good enough. There needs to be what we need to do is shift schools away from just this paralysing fear that politics is a disease. And that if you get involved in it, you'll catch it, you'll be accused of being partial, and the council will come down you like a ton of bricks. But the trouble is, the councils do come down on people like a ton of bricks for doing all sorts of things in schools. I know it. I know many people who are working in schools that can't even report that there are no social workers on duty when they've got kids that are in really difficult situations. So there's an awful scared community within schools in many respects, despite all the blah. There's a lot of fear in there, and there's a lot of top-down control, and there's a lot of jargony rubbish coming from on high. And when that's all true, you need the luck of the Irish to crack it.
Well, what you're saying is right. At the beginning of the debates that happened, 75%, 80% of the kids were no. But by the end of the entire campaign, it had completely reversed. And that's something that happened through conversation, through discussion. Now, okay, it happened in the schools, so if you got a debate in the school, we had debates in the school, but they got cancelled. It got that infection, that political infection, got into the schools. It did actually happen. It tried to get control, but it actually got in there. And it will happen again because 16-year-old school kids are voting. So it has to be discussed. And we got so much more support from 15-year-olds and 14-year-olds who got involved in politics for the first time. And not from schools, in the playground, because their pals were going to be voting and they were going to be It was quite amazing.
Well, that's true. I think it's true. It's true that there's also a counter-cultural thing starts to happen. I mean, the more... I remember, sorry, I was a long-time Van Morrison fan. I remember that line he got, you know, I believed in my soul after school. You know, so that kind of there's a demarcation in people's heads as to the stuff they get in school and then their soul after school. There's lots of things like the fashion movement that teaches Gaelic traditional learning. That's all out of school deliberately because that feels like a value area where you learn and take it to your heart. So there's lots of things to be said for having the formal bit of education being a bit sniffy about something that you then become intrigued about yourself. My concern is still, I'm not instrumental about any aspect of Scottish life. I'm not here to try to get to independence by just wangling our way through. We have to change ourselves. We have to change our society, or we end up with all the difficulties we have at the moment. We just pull them in, and it takes longer to deal with it all. We'll deal with it, but it takes unnecessarily long. Schools need to start being vigorous places on all sorts of issues, and they need to stop, they need to lose this crippling fear of local education authority control. So this is a long other discussion to get into, but my core thing is this, you know, the more we can encourage institutions to become more bottom-up, genuinely, not just kind of jargon-wise, and the more independent-minded people become, so that it's quite natural to look for lots of different views, that's the kind of set of people I would trust with anything, any decision. But people who are beholden, people who are frightened, people who are constantly looking over their shoulder for guidance, that's scary, you know. And I think that scares some no voters. They look around and they think, is this the vigorous set of people I want to be forging into the future with? So we need to get all this fear stuff out in the open on all sorts of issues, not just independence, because it is the Beecher's Brook of them all. It scares the living daylights out of most people in positions of authority. You can easily be starting to tackle this on some smaller issues that are much closer to home. The end.
Well, I think we can all agree that's been a fantastic evening, and food for thought in so many different ways. I've got to thank Lesley on behalf of everyone here for what's been a fascinating insight in the way in which the Nordic countries, I think, have approached their situation, both politically and economically. They're small countries, and if Scotland was to be independent, it's a small country. And with a small country, with politicians that we don't allow to go above their station, it means that if you meet the finance minister in the alleyway of, God forbid, Tesco, probably we would all like it to be Lidl or Aldi, you can have a chance of actually imposing some sort of social pressure on our government and the people that work for it. I think that's one of the great beauties about a small country. Having worked in Denmark and Sweden, I know that the Scandinavian model creates a much, much different society to the one that we've got today. But it certainly is one that we should aspire to, I would agree. So I want to say thanks again, Lesley, on behalf of